Today, I'm going to take a look at 1 Nephi 5:10-22, which is essentially a discussion of the brass plates. Lehi's family went through great travails to obtain these plates, and now at last they get to figure out why. Because, as we can see, they don't really know what's on the plates until they get them. So this section begins with Lehi searching the brass plates, which indicates that he probably didn't know what was on them, which probably indicates he didn't own a Bible, and probably indicates he had never read the Bible, which is quite typical of, would have been typical of a Jew in this period. First of all, the Bible didn't really exist as we know it today. And secondly, copies were very rare and expensive, and literacy was limited. In fact, if we look at archaeological examples of literacy in First Temple Israel, which is 6th century and earlier, we only have one biblical text out of all surviving Hebrew Jewish texts that we've got. Dana Pike, in an article that's listed there, surveys this material, and we have just one little passage from the Bible. We have lots of letters and stamps and seals and all sorts of different things, but nothing from the Bible. So the Bible as we know it didn't exist at this time, and it's perfectly reasonable that Lehi didn't know the contents of the brass plates and didn't have a copy of the Bible, which is exactly what the Book of Mormon tells us, which raises a question then. If Joseph Smith is supposedly the author of the Book of Mormon, why didn't he just simply assume that Lehi had a copy of the Bible and had read it? That would be a normal assumption for a 19th century person to have. But however that might be, it's clear the Book of Mormon is describing the realities of 6th century BC literacy and availability of the biblical text. So if you look then at the verses 10 to 14, they describe the details of what's contained on the brass plates. Actually, not the details, but rather a summary of what's contained on the brass plates. Notice that Lehi, when he gets the records, searches them. And I think it's important to recognize there's a difference between searching and reading. Searching means, of course, to examine very closely, to read carefully, to go into great depth, to study, to analyze, to try to understand beyond just reading. So it's kind of a model for how we should try to approach the scriptures, is in a searching intellectual mode rather than just merely reading them as we would a novel. Anyway, the contents of the brass plates include the 5 books of Moses, which starts with the creation of the world and an account of Adam and Eve. That's probably some version of the book of Genesis that describes those same things, the early chapters. Secondly, there's a record of the Jews described in verse 12, and it says, from the beginning. Doesn't tell us what the beginning is, but presumably from the beginning of the kingdom or the founding, beginning of Moses or something like that, down to the commencement of the reign of Zedekiah. And then thirdly, there are the prophecies of the holy prophets, again from the beginning to Zedekiah, but then also some of the prophecies of Jeremiah that have been apparently tacked on at this time. So what we've got then, if you look over in the right-hand side column, is, first of all, it talks about the 5 books of Moses. This is called, in Hebrew, the Torah, or the law. And then secondly, it talks about a record of the Jews, a history of the Jews, and that is called in Hebrew the writings, or the ketubim. And then finally, you have the writings of the prophets, which is called in Hebrew the Nevi'im, which means the prophets. Now notice, those 3 categories or 3 types of records, the Torah, the writings, and the prophets, are precisely how ancient Jews divided up or categorized the contents of the Hebrew Bible that they had. This is a very interesting reflection then of an ancient concept that appears in the Book of Mormon that probably would have not have been known to Joseph Smith necessarily. Anyway, contents then reflect this 3 divisions of the Bible. It's called the Tanakh in Hebrew, and it is an anagram, TNK, for T for Torah, N for Nevi'im, and K for Ketubim. Comes up with TNK, pronounced Tanakh. So the Book of Mormon describes the traditional Jewish way of dividing the Bible into those three categories of texts. Now notice, if you study the origins of the Hebrew Bible, we find there are, in fact, three different versions of the Bible that are known from history and archaeology that have many similarities, but also have many distinct differences. These are all pre-Christian, from the 2nd century BC or earlier. The Masoretic text is the text of the Hebrew Bible as the Jews finalized it in maybe the 6th or 7th century AD, but it reflects a much earlier version of the text as well. The Dead Sea Scrolls has most of the books of the Hebrew Bible, but often with significant variants. And then the Septuagint also has, this is the Greek translation of the Bible done in the 2nd century BC, about the same time as the Dead Sea Scrolls started. And this reflects a different version of the Bible. So there were, in fact, three different versions of the Bible by the 2nd century BC. And now we also have a brass plates version, which we only have hints about. But the brass plates then fits into this pattern of ancient, different editions of the Bible in antiquity. Again, something probably a 19th century farm boy wouldn't have understood. The brass plates also seem to reflect the northern Israel version of the records, or of the, Hebrew records. It talks about being from Joseph and not from Judah. And Joseph, of course, is Ephraim and Manasseh. And Ephraim is a common synonym for the northern kingdoms. So this is a northern Israel, not a southern Israel or Judean version of the sacred records. And therefore, again, differed. Some scholars, John Sorensen suggested that the brass plates might be equated with the Elohist, which is a one strand or editorial strand of the Hebrew Bible as understood by the documentary hypothesis. The Elohist is thought to have been a northern Israel record as opposed to a southern Israel. You can see the distinction of northern versus southern conceptualizations of things in the Book of Kings versus the Book of Chronicles. In the Book of Kings, you have discussions of both Judea and the northern kingdom, whereas in the Book of Chronicles, it's just a history of Judea. I mean, they'll mention the northern kingdom, but you don't have any detailed discussion. So it's very interesting that you've got, when you look at the Old Testament, it's clear there's different versions going on back there, and the brass plates fits into this pattern. Now, it also mentions that some of the prophecies of Jeremiah were in the bronze plates, and there's an interesting article on Jeremiah by David and Joanne Seeley that gives us some context for Jeremiah. But I think it's important to note, if you want to understand the spiritual setting of Lehi, the best source outside of the Book of Mormon is Jeremiah. He was, exactly contemporary with Lehi. They have many of the same overlapping concerns, and it's very interesting to read Jeremiah as a document that provides the spiritual, historical, prophetic, political setting for the Book of Mormon. Later on in the Book of Mormon, a number of prophets appear who are on the brass plates but do not appear in the Bible. So it's quite clear that the brass plates had additional records. The brass plates also, so they had more. They also had less. That is, we don't have some of the later prophets in there, like Zechariah and so forth. And they probably had different versions of the texts, maybe, shorter, longer, whatever. These texts were edited in antiquity. So we can't think of the brass plates as our Old Testament or as the Hebrew Bible as we know it. It is a version. It's an ancient variation of version of our Hebrew Bible. And that's an important distinction to make. Okay, on to the other thing that is mentioned in the document, in the bronze plates or brass plates. And remember, bronze and brass are the same conceptualization. Joseph Smith's day, brass was a archaic term from the Bible to describe what we now call bronze. Anyway, there's genealogy of Lehi contained in the text of the brass plates. Notice then that that's something that's not found in the Hebrew Bible as we know it. Now, Lehi is descended from Joseph, And later on in the text, I've got a couple verses there where it says explicitly from Manasseh, not from Ephraim. Manasseh and Ephraim were the two sons of Joseph. And it says Laban was a descendant of Joseph also, and that his family had kept the records, and that's why Laban had the brass plates, which would probably make Laban some type of relative of Lehi. I don't, maybe very distant, maybe closest, no way to tell. So notice the genealogy is not given. It's simply stated that the conclusion from the genealogy is that the Lehites are descended from Joseph. Why emphasize at this point Joseph? I think there's a number of different reasons. First of all, Nephi's conceptualization of his identity, he's not a Jew. He doesn't talk about himself as a Jew. He sees himself, of course, as an Israelite, but there's some tension between him and the Jews, probably because of the persecution of the people of Jerusalem against his father. But at any rate, he wants to emphasize I'm a different branch of Israel. But mainly it's because of issues of birthright and the prophetic promises and covenants of Joseph. And this is discussed further in 2 Nephi 3, so we'll discuss that when we come to that point. There's a little book as well on biblical genealogies. Genealogy was much more than just a list of ancestors to ancient peoples. It provided all sorts of concepts. It's also note that Joseph is emphasized because of a Joseph of Egypt typology. Basically, Nephi sees a connection, a spiritual, allegorical connection between himself and Joseph of Egypt, and this is reflected in lots of different characteristics that are described here in the Book of Mormon. I've listed some of the Book of Mormon references and their parallels to Genesis. So we have both a Moses typology and a Joseph typology that's going on here. And I suspect these are intentional on the part of Nephi, that he wants to, show this type to emphasize his spiritual connection to Joseph and to Moses. There's a lot of good articles on the brass plates. You take a look at them in this bibliography. It's available on the website at MormonScriptureExplorations.com. And those links to the online versions are active on a PDF file that I've got on that site. Now, when Lehi gets the brass plates, he is filled with the Spirit, and he starts to prophesy. Now, he prophesies a number of different things, but what is recorded by Nephi wants to record just certain special things. First of all, Lehi says that the brass plates will go to all nations. And this is going to be expounded upon later on in some of Nephi's visions. So we'll wait for a full discussion there, but there's two categories here. It goes to the nations. Now, notice that's Gentiles. Nation, it translates Goyim, and Goyim is Gentiles. So the brass plates will go to the Gentiles. Obviously, the Jews will have them. And from the Jews, they will go to the Gentiles. And then from the Gentiles, they will go to Lehi's seed. That is the descendants of Lehi and the Lamanites and so forth. Now, we shouldn't necessarily assume that, I do assume that this means this is referring to the Bible, the transmission of the Bible to Gentiles and to Native Americans. But I don't know if it necessarily implies that the book exactly the same as our Bible. It's possible it implies some future, transmission of the brass plates in a more direct way. I'm not really sure, but my assumption is it's referring to the Bible. He also prophesies that the plates will never perish or be dimmed. There's two ways to interpret this. One is that the physical plates themselves will never tarnish or corrode. And it's important to note that bronze, when it's polished and untarnished, looks very much like gold. It's very bright golden color metal. Bronze does corrode, but it gets a thin patina of kind of green rust. But the plate itself is never really damaged by that. It has this patina, and then it stops corroding. Now, iron will just rot. When iron rusts and corrodes, it just completely rots away. but bronze doesn't. So bronze actually survives archaeologically much better than iron. So it's one possibility is he's talking about the physical preservation of the plates, but another possibility is that it is the contents or the words of the plate that will never perish, and their brightness will never be dimmed, meaning their spiritual power will continue on. So it's possible. I mean, I'm not really sure which one he had in mind in 519. He also prophesies many other things concerning his seed, that is, his descendants, and this reflects an interesting characteristic of the Book of Mormon, and that is it talks all the time about texts and prophecies and so forth that they don't include in the Book of Mormon. So there's much more going on behind the scenes that isn't in the book. And Nephi talks in various places about why he includes or doesn't include certain things. So we get these hints of other documents, of other prophecies, revelations, visions that are never recorded, or at least aren't recorded and included in the Book of Mormon. So this chapter then concludes with the situation that Lehi has kept the commandment of the Lord. The commandment's given in 3:2-4 to go get the plates. He's obtained the plates. He's searched the plates, so he's come to understand their contents. And then this is confirmed that, as Nephi says, they are of great worth to us insomuch that we could preserve the commandments. Now this is reflecting back to the idea that God makes a covenant with Nephi that if he will keep the commandments of the Lord, he will prosper in the land. They didn't know what the commandments were for certain because they didn't have the brass plates, so they had to go and get them. Now they can keep those commandments because they have them. They have the scripture. And so, all of this is to fulfill the wisdom of the Lord so that the plates can be brought to the new land. So the conclusion, this then kind of concludes this episode that goes through chapters, really beginning in 3, 4, and 5,